Let me ask you this. What do you think the purpose of these three buildings is? And do they have anything in common? I mean, other than the fact that they're shockingly cheesy and hostile looking. Well, I'm not gonna keep you in suspense. That would be uncouth. They are entertainment venues. And so is this one, and this one, and this one. They do teach those time-tested Vitruvian principles in architecture schools, but only as a footnote, it would seem. Well, here's a quick crash course. Vitruvius wrote that a building's proportions should be based on human proportions.
How so?
Well, there's the base, the shaft, and the crown, and every detail speaks to every other detail.
Oh, okay.
In addition to that, there are these three aspects a master builder should focus on: strength, function, and beauty. Strength means, well, stability, of course. The maladjusted monstrosities they gratuitously erect today have an expiration date, 50-year lifespan, or sometimes in a fit of misplaced magnanimity, they mention a whole century. Of course, who cares what happens to it like 100 years from now, since none of us will be alive anyway. To my way of thinking, an architect or a developer who wants to be the next Madame de Pompadour should be immediately chased away and never lawfully be permitted to build anything anywhere ever. The correct answer when they ask you, how long do you think this building might last, would be, of course, indefinitely. And that's because we've got the technology, the materials, the resources, and the engineering to erect such buildings easily, reasonably quickly, and a great deal cheaper than at any other point in the past. Beauty means, well, in this case, harmony, ensemble, and ornament. More on that later. As for function, the implication is that a casual observer should be able to tell by just glancing at it what purpose this or that building serves. Like, this is a palace, this is a residential building, and this is a church. So, why shouldn't entertainment venues be just as easily recognized? What is this? A warehouse? A toaster? A gigantic, ravenous, unsympathetic insect ready to attack you? An iron? Wait, don't tell me. It's a handheld vacuum. No? Oh, it's a dowel. Well, here's a dowel. I don't know. I just don't see it. Wait a minute. They tell me it's an opera house. Okay, while the tradition of building ball courts, specifically Olmec and Mokaia, predates Greek and Roman theaters and stadiums, only some Maya courts are still standing. They are vernacular, but fascinating in their own way, especially when you remember that the pre-Columbian New World had neither horses nor oxen and therefore had no use for the wheel and axle combo. No wheel, no industry. It's amazing how some people casually say, oh, they didn't invent the wheel. A child of 3 can invent the wheel. A wheel is just a spherical object with its sides lopped off. Imagine you live in some exotic prehistoric territory and suddenly you go ahead and invent the wheel. Great. Now what? What are you going to do with it? Roll it around? Show it to your spouse? You know what she'll say.
Very nice. Now why don't you do something useful around the house instead of wasting time on this guano?
In order for a wheel to become even marginally useful, you'll need attachments, such as another wheel and maybe an axle to connect the two. Then what? Well, you put a board on top, you fasten it to the axle somehow, maybe stick another pair of wheels and an axle to the other side, and now you've got yourself a flatbed cart or a wagon. And nothing. There are some narrow paths out there. There's this wild terrain with all those holes and ruts and knolls and hills and displeased jaguars and cougars and snakes. What you'll need now is a horse or an ox, a beast of burden to pull that cart for you. Then, and only then, can you start thinking about infrastructure such as wider and smoother paths, what we call roads today. If you don't have horses, that wagon of yours is useless. It's like showing a Middle Kingdom pharaoh your design of a steam locomotive. Some pharaohs were inquisitive and perceptive, and you might get them interested. But then you'd have to explain metallurgy and how it would be necessary to start working with iron and steel and cast iron rather than bronze, and how you'd have to lay down tracks and maybe discover thitherto unknown qualities of coal. And you'll need lots and lots of wood, which is scarce in Egypt, for the ties. That's when the pharaoh will probably stop listening. Not because he's skeptical, but rather because he will correctly judge your project to be grossly impractical.
We've got roads, we've got chariots, what do we need this heavy monstrous machine for?
To transport great quantities of goods, tons upon tons of goods transported, and also passengers.
I see. Nah.
The entire population of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom was 2 million souls. That's less than today's population of Brooklyn. There was no need to transport tons upon tons of anything anywhere. By the same logic, there was no need, no practical purpose, to have the wheel and axle combo in the New World prior to the arrival of horses. And what certain cultures, the Incas, the Maya, the Aztecs, were able to accomplish without horses and with no metallurgy to speak of, it's astounding, especially given the distractions such as imperial wars, forced labor, quaint ritual offerings, and the near complete absence of logistics in the modern sense. They accomplished a lot, but I digress. So they built those ball courts, rammed earth clad in stone. The players tossed around a rubber ball weighing up to 10 pounds, using their hips only. And you'd think Canadians are crazy about hockey, huh? The Maya were obsessed with their ball games. Oh, and the gambling? Placing bets? You wouldn't believe it. Oh, and many used cocoa beans as cash, which in my opinion is an interesting idea. I mean, cocoa beans spoil, so they had to be spent fast. No point in hoarding, no one shoving anything under a mattress, imagine that. That's cash flow for you. That said, those ball courts, they were strong, all right, stable, built to last indefinitely. They may have been a bit short on beauty, but their function was unmistakable. Like, what is that?
That's a ball court. What did you think it was?
Now, the Greeks came up with this great idea for a performance venue. They'd carve out a hill and construct an amphitheater. So you got this shell, great natural acoustics. The sound from the stage below carries all the way to the upper tiers easily. Initially, they used planks and fabric for the makeshift backdrop, but eventually they started building the skini. They called it skini, an often ornamented brick or stone structure, which could also be used as the backstage area, where the actors could drink water, change, or throw hissy fits, as actors do. Please subscribe to my Patreon. It helps support this channel. My Patreon consists entirely of videos on topics other than architecture, like culture, history, the economy, movies, religion, science, space, and many, many more.
I attest to that.
Thank you. Then came the Romans and began to industrialize everything as was their wont. And so there appeared freestanding arenas like the Coliseum and freestanding theater buildings like the Marcellus Theater. That set the standard. Please note that those answered to all three Vitruvian requirements. There was strength, they're still standing 2,000 years later. There was beauty, yes, they're highly proportionate. Every detail speaks to every other detail. And note the hierarchy of the Coliseum. Doric columns at the bottom, Ionic in the middle, Corinthian at the top. And all those arches. The core was bricks buried in Roman concrete. The surface was clad in limestone. A lot of that limestone is gone today, alas, and I suspect age has nothing to do with it. Folks tore it off and carried it away for their own little egotistical needs. This was allowed, even encouraged at times. It was an open air arena, capacity 55,000 souls. Not bad for the first century AD, huh? Then we have a gap, a huge gap. After the fall of Rome, Vitruvian architectural stadiums and theaters declined, went out of fashion. I realize some folks would blame it on the church, like sinful and all that. That's pure guano. Just like today, stadiums and theaters in ancient Rome were heavily subsidized by the state. Yes, bread and circuses, of course, pizza and YouTube. That was the policy, to keep the population, especially the lower strata, entertained. The emperor's treasury was the principal source of money for all those engineers, masons, actors, playwrights, gladiators, security guards, and janitors. You might argue that today's arenas are self-sustaining, commercially viable. Yeah, right. What about the tax breaks and polite requests leveled at the state government to chip in? And threats to move to a different state if they don't. So when the money finally ran short, the Roman Empire found it could no longer afford to sustain exceedingly expensive spectacles. The venues fell into disrepair, no theaters, no arenas for centuries. There were some in China and Japan, but those were wooden structures, so they don't count as architecture. In the 16th century, freestanding theaters were built in England. English drama, the stepchild of the church's mystery play, became popular enough for purpose-built theaters to be commercially viable. There were no serious backdrop designs, no sets, just some props. Normally to inform the audience that the action in the following scene would be occurring in a forest or a castle or on the riverbank, a sober stagehand would walk across the stage with a placard saying "Woods" or "Castle," and those in the audience who could read would elucidate the message for the illiterate. But those playhouses, they too were wooden structures, so they don't count either.
They don't?
Sorry. Over in France and elsewhere, plays were performed wherever. In barns, out on the street, at the marketplace. Companies that were lucky, sufficiently popular among the aristocracy, they plied their trade at home theaters, in palaces and castles. Those were eventually restructured to accommodate certain theatrical demands. Italians came up with some pretty impressive, highly intricate stage machinery, creating all kinds of dramatic illusions, some of them extremely realistic. Yeah. Some freestanding theaters began to appear in the 18th century when certain theater companies became extremely popular and some performers gained star status. But the real breakthrough, to my way of thinking, occurred when opera as an art form finally came into its own, when it stopped being just symphony with vocals and became opera as we know it. Giacomo Meyerbeer, the father of grand opera, that's a style and a movement and a period. Giacomo Meyerbeer is the name that comes to mind immediately when you try to think of a single person who greatly facilitated the development of the genre. His principal idea was that opera was not just a play with a text where the text is sung rather than spoken. No, each performance had to be a festivity. Lavish, sumptuous, irresistible, spare no expense, A large orchestra, music to fit the size, sophisticated stage machinery, lavish costumes. Yes, in the 19th century, opera demanded its own home, and got it. Freestanding, purpose-built theaters with intricately engineered acoustics, excellent sets, stage machinery, restrooms, and all the rest of it. Here are some examples. Vienna Opera, Paris Opera with its famous lobby, Venice, London, St. Petersburg, Milan, Philadelphia. In the 20th century, a few others were added, such as San Francisco, New York. Vocal training had to change. The new theaters were large, and so were the orchestras, and voices had to be heard over them. Before that, well, that movie Amadeus, which is in fact colorful, clever, well written, extremely well acted, is also highly misleading on several aspects. For instance, in the movie, when conducting their operas, both Salieri and Mozart faced the orchestra, which would have been interpreted as a sign of disrespect. Not during rehearsals, of course, but certainly during live performances, you were expected to face the audience. The first conductor and composer who turned his back on the audience because he had a huge orchestra to work with and had to watch those rascals closely was Richard Wagner. Also, public theaters had no orchestra pits. The musicians just sat in front of the stage like a bunch of morons. Some actually sat on the stage. The idea of shoving them in the pit, below the audience's sightlines, was again Wagner's. Oh, and since we're talking about Wagner anyway, you may have noticed that when you go to a theater, be it a drama, opera, or movie theater, uh, the lights in the auditorium are switched off when the performance starts. Guess who? Yes, before Wagner, the auditorium lights stayed on so that the audience could confab, gawk at one another across the seats through binoculars, who came with whom and what that snot-nosed hussy is wearing tonight, and even play cards in the boxes. Composers and performers hated it, but it was Wagner who actually said, okay, enough's enough, and stood his ground. No talking, shut up and listen, everybody. Despite the popularity, theater, drama, and opera was never continuously profitable for any meaningful period of time, depending instead on benefactors, donations, and state sponsorship. There was the occasional burst of profitability, like here and there, like those commercial music theaters catering to the common folk in Vienna. One of those is also shown in Amadeus, where Mozart's Magic Flute premiered and became an instant hit. A theater entrepreneur would rent some space, hire performers, commission a play or an opera, and hope desperately that the ticket sales would exceed the expenses. Sometimes that's what happened. Other times it didn't. Or when our own Met, that would be the Metropolitan Opera House Company, started to put on Wagner's operas, entire seasons of them in the 1880s, and the German diaspora in New York was huge at that moment, and a lot of them were in fact well-educated people. They packed the house for several years in a row, night after night. Yes, the Met actually turned a profit during that period. But generally speaking, either the profit margins are razor thin, or far more often, theater companies and buildings rely on donors, many of whom were and are vain enough to ask politely that their name be carved in gold on a wall somewhere, in a reasonably prominent spot, or at least mentioned in brochures. What did the Savior say about that? Well, you'll recall, right? But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth. That's explicit, and I'm pretty sure that deep down, most people know that that is the right way and the only way. Either you're donating money or you're purchasing popularity. It can't be both. But man is weak, so donors go, Yeah, but I really, really want some people to know what an amazing, wonderful, generous guy I am. Okay, maybe not all people, but maybe just those huddling in the foyer. Uh, whom would it hurt, really? But that's a side issue, I suppose. Now, stadiums and arenas have fared a lot worse than theaters when it comes to architecture. Stadiums and arenas are notoriously ugly, most of them.
With some exceptions.
Yeah, of course. Yankee Stadium, despite those glum authoritarian overtones, is clearly a stadium and not a gigantic barber shop or mall or a disoriented tortoise.
Where am I? What day is this?
And Citi Field, the facade unequivocally declares this is a stadium. But those are exceptions. Most arenas are repulsive, with no clearly pronounced function. And I hasten to add, it's been like this, yeah, since humanity rediscovered the attraction of organized team sports and began to industrialize it. Here's something that might surprise some people. We modern people, we had this a shamefully poor understanding of Roman spectator sports culture until the Industrial Revolution handed us an opportunity to develop our own. We had no idea. Yeah, we knew about the chariot races and gladiators and whatnot. We knew about the cruelty, the martyrs, the wild beasts, which in Rome was, by the way, a separate category. What we did not know was that Roman games provided three things that constitute a sports industry: massive scale, continuous schedules, and deep tribal loyalty. Team sports like baseball, football, basketball, and hockey and soccer require a fixed home base. They need to play from 30 to 100 games a year in the exact same spot, which justifies the enormous financial investment required to build permanent urban stadiums. Suddenly, cities had to solve the exact same architectural problem the Romans had faced and solved: rapid crowd evacuation, dedicated ticket gates, and zone seating. Finally, we grasped it. We understood the general principle. Our execution, on the other hand, was less satisfactory. The designers of our stadiums and arenas completely abandoned the core Vitruvian principles of harmony and expression. A building's form should seamlessly communicate its function to a casual observer, while the details should speak to each other in perfect proportion, remember? Instead, our arenas ignore their environments entirely. Just look at the four, yes, there have been four iterations of Madison Square Garden. The designers should have been ashamed of themselves. Here's the first one, yeah, and here's the second one, and here's the third one. To build the fourth, the idiots demolished an unquestionable architectural masterpiece admired by all fans of such things around the globe. People from Paris, a city famous, among other things, for those Haussmannian train terminals, came to New York just to see it, the old Penn Station. It was demolished in the 1960s and replaced with this windowless, faceless drum. Following World War II, theater designers started to catch up. I mean, they too wished to get their paychecks and their awards for building monstrosities. So this is Dubai Opera. And this is the Opera House of Copenhagen, Denmark. This is Alto Theater in Essen, Germany. The National Theater for Performing Arts in Tokyo. The Santa Fe Opera House. And because Paris was not satisfied with Palais Garnier, they built themselves a new one. Here's the Bastille Opera House.
It's a shame.
Let me express this one spicy thought. Today, the Symphony Hall and the Opera House are the only two options that you have if you want to hear actual live music, vocals and instruments. No amplifiers, no speakers, live music. But that's a story for another day, or for my Patreon. Once upon a time, there was this sultan called Suleiman the Magnificent. He was the ruler of the entire Ottoman Empire. He had some pretty interesting ideas. For instance, if you raise the country's cultural level through architecture, art, and literature, everything else will suddenly start falling into place. The economy, the military, housing, food production, work ethic, hygiene, everything will suddenly improve. Unfortunately, when the elite does not believe in the ultimate judge of aesthetics and has neither taste nor any respect for fellow human beings, regardless of their social status, this is what we get. Thank you for watching. I'm Ricky Vernier coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, and I'll see you soon.